Sometimes, in the silence of the night, when everything around you slowly comes to rest, there are only two sounds left: your breath and the soft, endless murmur of a sea you cannot see. And somewhere deep inside you, a thought emerges, slowly, like a figure out of the fog. What lies beneath this surface? Beneath all the waves, the dark water, the currents we know nothing about, lost streets, collapsed temples, windows that no one looks through anymore. And then, another thought, quieter, more persistent. What if one of those stories we always believe to be just myths were true? What if a city described in ancient writings had actually sunk into the sea? A city said to have been inhabited by a god himself. A city called Dwarka. Tonight, we descend, slowly, deeper, into the story of Dwarka, India's Atlantis. A story between faith and geology, between longing and stone. You travel through this unimaginable experience with Wondeworld, and as you become a little calmer with each breath, you can just let yourself drift down into this dark, silent depth. Imagine standing on the coast of Gujarat in Western India. At night, it is not a tourist postcard coast. No white sand, no colorful umbrellas, just a narrow, dark strip of land. The smell of salt, and in front of you, the Gulf of Khambhat. The sea is black, not just dark blue, but really black, like ink reflecting the light of the stars. The waves roll in steadily, not threatening, more like a gentle animal breathing in its sleep. And as you stand there, you can imagine that beneath this black, calm surface, something is hidden. Something ancient, something that was no longer meant for human eyes. And yet, it has not completely disappeared. People here have been telling stories about a city for centuries. Dwarka, once golden, full of temples, palaces, walls, and towers. A city where, so they say, Krishna himself lived, not as a distant, intangible deity, but as a ruler, a king, as someone who walked streets whose stones you could have touched. A city that then disappeared, taken by the sea, swallowed by the waves. For a long time, Dwarka was just that. A story, a sacred place in texts, a name in prayers. And yet, many felt that there was more to this name than just a story. Something in us loves such stories because they touch on a quiet hope that beneath the surface of our world, there is much more hidden than we find in schoolbooks. In ancient writings, the Puranas, Dwarka is described in such detail that it seems strange when one thinks only of myth. There is talk of a fortress, of 7 great walls surrounding the city, of gates adorned with precious stones, of streets that are said to have been so smooth and bright that they almost glowed in the sunlight, of palaces whose roofs were gilded, where music played and fires burned that never went out. Krishna, the central figure of this city, is not only a god in Hindu tradition, but also a king, friend, and advisor. The scriptures describe how he lived in Dwarka, how he ruled, how he laughed, how he planned wars and made peace. Dwarka is not just a place. but a stage on which a divine life is told. And then, at some point, this stage ends. After Krishna's death, according to legend, the time of this city was over. The sea drew closer. The waves became a boundary that slowly but inexorably crept over the city. And finally, as if the earth itself had decided to reclaim this place, Dwarka is said to have sunk into the sea, a golden city swallowed by black water. It sounds like a fairy tale, like a symbol of transience, of the realization that even the greatest, the most beautiful, does not last forever. And yet, one question remains. What if these images refer to something real? These stories have been told for millennia, by the fire, in temples, during rituals, at festivals in honor of Krishna. For many believers, Dwarka was never just a fairy tale. It was a sacred place, a real part of the world, even if it could no longer be seen with the naked eye. The longing for this place remained, perhaps in the same way that we sometimes long for Atlantis, for proof that there was once an advanced civilization out there that was far ahead of ours, a civilization that disappeared without leaving us its answers. Over time, the first researchers began to read the texts with a different perspective, not only as religious poetry, but also as a possible clue. Place names were compared, coastlines were examined, old reports of floods were collected, and finally, questioning glances turned to this very stretch of coastline in western India, to the sea that now lies before your inner eye, to the dark, sleeping waters of Gujarat. In the 1980s, something began that many would have considered impossible until then. Archaeologists went into the sea, not just with their imagination, but with boats, measuring instruments, oxygen tanks, among them teams from the National Institute of Oceanography in India. They were looking for traces of a city, not for gold, not for magical artifacts, but for stone, for structures, for patterns that do not arise by chance. Imagine how they sail out there, across these silent, dark waters that reveal no secrets to the outside world. The surface world seems harmless. A light breeze, perhaps a few lights from a coastal town in the distance, but beneath the boat, layers of water, sand, mud, time. Divers descend. The world turns greenish, then bluish, then gray. Sounds disappear. All that remains is your own breathing and the muffled sound of the sea. Lamps cut funnels of light into a darkness that seems very old. And then, in the middle of this nothingness, shapes appear. Stones, not just scattered, but in lines, walls, right angles, foundations that look more built than natural. In several places on the seabed, something emerges that looks like floor plans. The researchers map the area. The structures they gradually discover cover about 980,000 square meters, almost 1 million square meters, an area that would be large enough for an entire city. For Dwarka, the facts are sobering, and that is precisely why they are so fascinating. At a depth of about 3 to 12 meters, the teams encounter the remains of walls, stone blocks, pedestals, foundations. They are stone anchors, triangular, prismatic. Some look as if ships had been moored here, long before modern ports existed. Pottery emerges, parts of vessels whose shapes are reminiscent of early Indian cultures. Some finds are examined, dated, classified. Much points to an ancient port city, not to a fantasy world, but to a lively place with trade, with ships, with people who came and went. An archaeologist, S.R. Rao, will later argue that these finds could belong to a very ancient city, perhaps around 1500 BC, not at the time when many believers locate Krishna, not at the time of the oldest myths, but old enough to slightly shift our perception of the history of the region. At the same time, there are voices that go further. They claim that evidence has been found here of a civilization that is far older than all known advanced civilizations. They speak of forbidden archaeology, of concealed data, of artifacts that are supposedly thousands of years older than any known date. Between sober science and wild speculation, a space opens up, a dark intermediate area where facts and desires mix. It is precisely in this space that our imagination often moves when we think of India's Atlantis. When people say Atlantis, they rarely mean just a sunken city. Often they mean a dream. The dream that there once was an advanced civilization that was more advanced than us, smarter, more spiritual, technologically superior. A civilization that perhaps knew how to live with nature, how to use energy, how to avoid wars. One that then disappeared without leaving us its secrets. Now, when the remains of an ancient city are found off the coast of India, it is almost inevitable that this dream will become associated with the stories. India's Atlantis. That is what many documentaries, articles, and videos call the finds at Dwarka. The image is enticing. Krishna, the divine city, the 7 rings of fortifications, the golden streets. Add to that the reality of a sunken port city, submerged walls, weathered anchors. It feels as if 2 worlds are touching, the world of texts, prayers, hymns, and the world of sediments, rocks, dating. Perhaps this is precisely where the deep fascination of Dwarka lies. It is not a pure invention that cannot be pinned down anywhere, but it is also not a completely deciphered archaeological site. There is something there, but not enough to answer all the questions. It is precisely this in-between that attracts us. Now, imagine you are one of those divers. Slowly floating above the seabed of Gujarat, you see the remains of walls, covered with algae, stone bricks, some of them sinking into the sand. Your beam of light skims over a row of stones that look like the steps of a long-forgotten staircase. You know that water can sometimes be deceiving, that currents, sediments, geological processes can create shapes that look like architecture. And yet, in a moment of silence, something may stir within you. A quiet, not entirely rational thought. Perhaps I am standing above a road that thousands of years ago was walked on by people, merchants, priests, children, soldiers, women with water jugs, men with ship ropes. Perhaps above me back then, there were not tons of water, but sun, dust, voices. Perhaps there was once a lively city here, and now I am its only visitor. For a moment, you can allow yourself to feel this thought, not as fact, as possibility, as a whisper from a very distant time. Archaeology, as sober as it wants to be, always touches something else in us. When we read that structures have been found on almost 1 million square meters of land, that there are anchors that point to early maritime trade, that ceramic fabrics indicate certain eras, then not only knowledge is created, an image is created, a quiet inner cinema. We see ships docking, we see markets where spices are sold, fabrics, metal. We may see the glimmer of a temple on the horizon as the sun sets, and somewhere in this picture stands Dwarka, sometimes golden, sometimes made of sandstone, sometimes made of words, sometimes made of data. But which of these is true? Perhaps that is not the most important question. More important might be why we wish it were true. Perhaps part of the answer lies not in the sea, but within us, in the quiet suspicion that our present is not everything, that beneath our cities, beneath our streets, beneath our decisions, lie layers that we rarely see. Old mistakes, forgotten wisdom, suppressed memories. A sunken city is also a symbol of something we have repressed, something that was once important and then disappeared. When we long for India's Atlantis, perhaps we long for a sense of depth, for the knowledge that our history is not just a thin line, but an ocean with many layers. Dwarka, as we know it today, exists on several levels simultaneously. As a sacred place of faith, as a coastal city in India that can be visited today with temples, pilgrims, rituals, as a possible partially sunken city under the sea, reduced to stone, structure, fragments, and as a projection screen for our deep desires for more history, more meaning, more secrets. When you now slowly emerge from this story, you can imagine that you are standing on the nighttime coast again. The sea is still black. The waves still roll in calmly. Above you, stars twinkle, as if they know nothing of our questions. Dwarka is still out there, in texts, in stones, in water, in mines. Researchers will continue to measure, date, discuss. Believers will continue to pray, sing, celebrate, and somewhere in between, you may think of this sunken city every now and then, not because it gives you a definitive answer, but because it reminds you that beneath the surface of our world and of your own life, there is always more than meets the eye. Perhaps not every story needs to be completely resolved to be valuable. Some are allowed to remain what Dwarka is for many, a quiet shadow under the water, a hint of something greater, a place where myth and reality almost touch. Take another deep breath and slowly exhale. Let the sea inside you calm down. Dwarka can wait. The waves are in no hurry, and you can now simply let go and glide into sleep at your own pace. This is where your journey with Wonderworld ends for today. Join us again next time, and don't miss out on the incredible impressions you gain with us. Pull your blanket up a little higher and relax.